Okay, thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to be taking a look at Psalm 29. Now, we were supposed to take a look at this psalm last week, but weather conditions impacted the internet, which means we couldn't get a lesson up. So we'll take a look at it tonight. Now, if you remember, the last time we met, I gave you the assignment to read Psalm 29 and to summarize the strophes and write a one-sentence summation of what you found. We're going to compare my notes with your notes as we go along. But before we do that, let's consider just a little introductory information about this psalm. This is a psalm that is ascribed to David, as you can see that clearly. You can see this clearly in the superscription here. And it's classified as a psalm of praise. That is, it's a psalm that seeks to extol the power of the Lord and His majesty, especially in this particular psalm, that power and majesty that is seen in a thunderstorm. Now, when you read commentaries on this and read some scholars on this particular psalm, it's believed that this psalm serves as sort of a counterpoint, a polemic, an argument against the Canaanite practice of Baal worship. Now, Baal was their supreme god. He was a fertility god and often pictured as in the storm. He was the storm god of the Canaanites. But in this particular psalm, Yahweh, the Lord, is pictured as the true master of the storm. And in addition, all of creation is subject to His power. So basically, it's David's, hey, take that, Baal, that sort of psalm. And, keep that in mind. But rather than ending in terror, as you go through this psalm, you see for the people of the Lord, for Israel, the idea of a God who reigns, who is powerful, yes, produces reverence, but also is seen as a source of blessing and wholeness. And the last verses of this particular psalm, it says in verses 10 and 11, the Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. May the Lord give strength to His people. May the Lord bless His people with peace. That's a little bit of an intro to this psalm. But before we compare notes, I also want to notice that different translations will have a different strophe count as we look at this psalm. The standard Bible that I use is the ESV, and it is formatted in 6 strophes. However, most commentators, as well as the New American Standard and the Christian Standard Bible, format this in 3 strophes, which is the form that I will use. Now, we need to remember that these strophes are editorial decisions based on the translation committee and on word patterns and cadence found in the text. And in the case of this particular psalm, it makes sense to divide it into 3 sections rather than 6, because there is a large portion in the very middle where we see a repetitive phrase. And I'm using the Christian Standard Bible today. But you see the repetitive phrase, the voice of the Lord, the voice of the Lord, the voice of the Lord. So rather than break this out, since it's obviously dealing with a similar theme, we find this 7 times within verses 3 to 9. It's best to view those as one section. So let's go, and I'll read to you the summaries that I have for the strophes before we start looking at the text. And let's start with the first strophe, which is verses 1 and 2. Now that's going to be consistent across your translations. Verses 1 and 2 is strophe 1. And this is a threefold call for heaven and the heavenly host to extol the majesty and the power of the Lord. Then we go to the second strophe, and remember I said this is different than what you'll find in the ESV. Verses 3 through 9 is the second strophe. Based off the frequency of the repeating word phrases that we find near the voice of the Lord. And if I was going to summarize that, this would be the power and glory of God pictured in terms of a storm which thunders His voice. And then we see the third strophe in verses 10 and 11 that we've just read, strophe 3. And this is, the people of God find comfort, not terror, in the powerful voice of the Lord. So 3 strophes, and while that may be a bit tricky for us, we have the ability to, there's some subjectiveness to this particular kind of breakdown. Here's how I would summarize the entire psalm. The covenant God of Israel is powerful and sovereign over his creation, and though spoken of in terrifying terms by the psalmist, the Lord is benevolent and the source of Israel's wholeness, or Israel's shalom. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's take a look at how I got there by looking at the text. And we'll start by focusing on the first strophe, verses 1 and 2. I'm going to change colors to something that's a little different from what we've been using to make my notes. Strophe 1 and 2, which is basically a call to praise. Again, here's the summary. A threefold call for heaven to extol the majesty, power, and glory of God. And the text reads, "Ascribe to Yahweh, you heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to Yahweh the glory due his name. Worship Yahweh in the splendor of his holiness." Now, a few things stick out in our mind. You see the term ascribe written twice, 3 times here. Ascribe, ascribe, ascribe. And what does it mean when we talk about ascribing something? Well, it doesn't mean to instill the subject with something. Rather, it's a recognition of something, specifically when we're talking about God. And you can see the covenant name of God appearing numerous times here. So we know that this is in a covenant context. Ascribe to Yahweh. What are we to ascribe to Yahweh? Glory and strength that is due his name. Now remember, in that context, name is often tied to the idea of reputation. The reputation of God, the glory due his reputation as the creator God, as the sovereign king of all creation. So this is the picture that we see here. So when we ascribe to Yahweh glory and strength, the psalmist isn't calling on something or someone to instill God with glory and strength, because nothing can be added to God, because God's perfect in all aspects. Rather, this is a call to recognize and to praise already existing attributes of the Lord. And that's why the New English translation renders it, acknowledge Yahweh, you heavenly beings. Acknowledge the Lord, the glory and strength of the Lord. That sort of a picture. And again, who is the one that David is calling to make this recognition? Well, he's not calling on earthly beings to make this recognition, although that is also appropriate. He's calling on heavenly beings to do this. It literally says sons of God. And it in the English Standard Version is, "O heavenly beings." And this simply refers to the host of heaven, the various heavenly beings that exist. David is calling on all of heaven to recognize and to praise Yahweh. We see this same sort of thought in Psalm 89, verses 5 and 7. "Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? A God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones." In the council of the holy ones, among the assembly of the holy ones. Talking about the heavenly host. And this is the same group that David is saying he's calling for them to recognize the glory of God. Now, there is kind of an interesting thing right here. And this is pointed out by Donald Williams in the Preacher's Commentary. And he notes that based off this idea of ascribing, his calling upon people and heavenly beings to worship God. But worship here, as we see, by ascribing something, is giving to God. It's not getting from God. Often when people consider worship today, they think, well, what did I get out of it? Me, my. That's such an egotistical way to approach worship. That's not what worship is about. And we see David setting the psalm straight that worship is giving to God. It's a recognizing of God's, it's ascribing glory, strength, and majesty due to God in the splendor of God's holiness, which is the picture that we see here. So you see a picture, an idea about strength and glory. And these two terms are going to be put forward in the second strophe, seen in the various aspects of the voice of the Lord. So let's look at the second strophe. Remember, the first strophe is a threefold call for heaven to extol the majesty and the power of God. So let's look at the second strophe, which is verses 3 through 9. And this is basically a demonstration of the power of God as seen in a thunderstorm. And here's, again, the summary of it. The power and glory of God pictured in terms of a storm. Let's go ahead and just read this. The voice of the Lord is above the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord above vast waters. The voice of the Lord in power, the voice of the Lord in splendor. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord shatters the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, and Syrian, that's also a name for Mount Hermon, and Syrian like a wild ox. The voice of the Lord flashes flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth and strips the woodlands bare. In his temple all cry glory. A majestic, powerful, and, if we're honest, frightening picture of God. We had thunderstorms in our area just 2 nights ago, and I remember in the middle of the night, about 3 o'clock, it sounded like some lightning just came down and struck 5 feet from our window. And the house shook. And how my kids slept through that, I have no idea. But that was an awe-inspiring moment. It was a moment that reminded me how small I am in comparison to the power of the storm. And our God is greater than that storm. And his power, though, here in this psalm is pictured in terms of a storm. So it's just kind of interesting thoughts as we go along through here. 3 times David calls, as we looked at this, we saw him ascribing glory. Again, like I said before, I agree with the Christian Standard Bible and the New American Standard Bible that the next 4 strophes in the ESV are better grouped as one. And this is on the basis of, notice how many times we see this. 7 times. The voice of the Lord is above waters. The voice of the Lord in power. The voice of the Lord in splendor. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Now, these are powerful images that we find here. The voice of the Lord flashes flame of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The voice of the Lord makes the deer gives birth and strips the woodlands bare. Do you see now why it seems better to go ahead and group all that in one section? We don't find the phrase, the voice of the Lord, outside of verses 3 through 9. So to break them into smaller groups, especially when it's just dealing with a natural picture of God's power in terms of a storm, in various ways. So there's no real reason to view that. It makes sense to group that into one group, and that's why we do that. So we have, after this initial call for recognition of glory and strength of the Lord, we have the power of the Lord exemplified in powerful and expressive natural terms. A powerful thunderstorm. In fact, if you look at the way that it's developed, it rolls in off the Mediterranean. It says, you see the idea of seas and waters. So you see it coming in off the Med, and then it begins in the northern part of the Promised Land, and the storm shifts south and runs the entire length of the Promised Land. So it rolls in off the Med, and then you see it sweeping down. It's pictured as moving from the northern part. Lebanon refers to the area towards Mount Hermon and then moving down to the lower extremity. And when it talks about Kadesh, it's probably Kadesh Barnea, which is a very important location for God's people. It was a site of one of their greatest failures. And the Lord is rolling in, pictured as demonstrating his power throughout all the promised land. And the imagery suggests God's power and sovereignty over typical things that concern man. Take a look at this particular thing here. We'll go and let me change colors. We'll try a orange here. It says, the Lord is above the waters. And we see this mentioned twice here, above vast waters. Well, yeah, that's a picture of a storm rolling in off the Mediterranean. But when you look at the ancient Near East context, waters are often used in that cultural context to represent chaos, political unrest. In the Genesis account, you see the Genesis account in verses Genesis 1, 6 through 10, where God is ordering the water to obey him, and the water withdraws and dry land comes forth. That is completely different from the creation accounts in other ancient Near East cultures, where the deities are pictured as battling water. God here is pictured as being superior to that. And so God is superior to water. He brings order from chaos. He orders the water and the water to obey. This is the picture of God over the chaos of the world. God is sovereign, regardless of how man in his puny might say, and thunder away in their limited power. God is always greater, as Nebuchadnezzar would find out in the Old Testament, wouldn't he? And we see this similar theme being carried through in the New Testament. This theme of controlling water and chaotic forces is found in Jesus, who commands the water, who commands the storm, and it obeys. And it brings about the question in Mark chapter 4, verses 39 through 41. He says to the sea, he rebuked it, "Peace, be still," and the wind ceased, and there was great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Because they knew that commanding the elements like that was something that was only in the purview of God. And in this instant, Jesus is demonstrating his equality with the Father as far as power and dominion over creation. So it's really an interesting picture. So being a voice above the waters, the Lord is saying more than just, I'm a storm blowing in from the Med. It's a picture of being over the chaos that we find, and the Lord is exerting his power over that. The voice of the Lord in power, the voice of the Lord in splendor. Then the next image that we see, demonstrating God's sovereignty over things in life. And you might say, well, what is that? Well, it talks about him breaking cedars, but not just cedars, but the cedars of Lebanon. Now, if you remember from the biblical accounts, just if you know anything about trees, cedars are massive, strong trees. And some of the strongest trees that were used in the development and the construction of the temple, both the first temple and the second temple, were cedars from Lebanon, because that area was very forested and they're very strong. They were symbols of strength. And in in the Old Testament, you find them being used often even as symbols of strength, human strength in a neutral sense. In the Song of Solomon, the woman is describing her lover as having legs like alabaster columns set on bases of gold. His appearance is like Lebanon, choice as the cedars. That's a picture of strength. But we also see that the cedars of Lebanon are often at times, especially in the prophetic writings, emblematic of the pridefulness of man who trusts in his own might. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 12 through 17, the Lord is pronouncing judgment against the prideful. And it says, "For the Lord has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low, against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, and against all the oaks of Bashan." Now, do you think God is actually pronouncing judgment against a tree? Or does that tree represent those who trust in themselves, who count their own power? Yeah, that's what's actually happening here. So when we take a look at this, this is a symbol of God demonstrating his power over pridefulness, over the insignificant might of man in light of who he is. And I can tell you, just from a natural sense, when that lightning hit outside our house the other night, I knew exactly how small I was in the great in the great order of the cosmos. So there are times when we see people who get, as we say in Oklahoma, too big for their britches, and they need to be put in line. And the Lord is pictured as one who breaks the cedars. So, yes, big trees, storm moving through, the power of God, but also emblematic at times of the pridefulness of man. And then we also see the third picture here of the Lord demonstrating his power in various aspects of life, where it talks about the voice of the Lord shaking the wilderness of Kadesh. Well, the wilderness, when you consider, yes, it's down in the arid areas south of, the Dead Sea, in that area where the wilderness wanderings took place. It's understood in the Bible as a place of peril, a place where resources are often lacking. In fact, it's mentioned in Deuteronomy 8:15, where he talks about God who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground, where there was no water, who brought you water out of the rock. Anyway, it's a picture of a place of trouble, of challenge, of difficulties in the Bible, especially when you consider that Kadesh Barnea is a place that is tied to the location where Israel chose to ignore the good report of Caleb and Joshua in Numbers 13 and 14, rejecting Moses, and by doing that, rejecting God's goodness, bringing upon themselves the judgment of God. They panicked because they lost sight of the Lord in the midst of the trials and the problems that they face. And when it talks about the Lord shaking the wilderness of Kadesh, sure, lightning and thunder booming through that area would rumble the area and shake the ground. But I kind of believe that this is maybe pointing to another domain where the Lord has control. And that is, in the difficult times of life, God is still sovereign. And I think that's something that's important for us to remember right now in the midst of a pandemic, that God is still sovereign, that God is still in control. And creation shakes at the voice of the Lord who commands and made it. This is all going to move to the crescendo here in the third strophe, which is verses 10 and 11, which moves to a statement of trust. So it begins with a call to praise, all the heavenly host to praise. Then there's the demonstration of this fearful power of God over various aspects of life, and it's seen in natural terms, and it ends with a statement of trust, of hope, and an acknowledgement that the Lord gives his people peace or wholeness. So I can summarize this as the inhabitants below, specifically Israel, because we find a lot of covenant terms here. Lord, Yahweh appears an awful lot. They find comfort in the Lord's voice. Whereas others who are opposed to God might find terror, God's covenant people in good standing with him find comfort in the voice. The Lord sat enthroned at the flood. The Lord sits enthroned, king forever. The Lord gives his people strength. The Lord blesses his people with peace. It moves from the image of a storm to that of a benevolent king, a cosmic ruler with complete sovereignty, but not detached, one who cares, one who is willing to bless his people. And it says the Lord sits enthroned twice. He's enthroned at the flood. Now, again, water's a symbol of perhaps dominion over chaos. It may reference judgment, the flood of Noah, that kind of a thing. And it says that he sits enthroned, ruling as a king forever. He is the eternal divine sovereign. The New English translation renders it enthroned as the eternal king. And as a result of this, his people find comfort and strength and peace rather than terror. And this text is better rendered as not as a plea, but rather as an expectation of the providential action of that divine ruler as it unfolds throughout time. The Lord gives and continues to give. The Lord blesses his people. But while these elements are certainly frightening and spectacle that we've just seen, this powerful and sovereign Creator God is also the benevolent Creator God of Israel. And the last verse, verse 11, presents the hope of the Lord's strength being exercised towards his people. Their desire, may the Lord bless his people with peace, or the Lord blesses his people with peace. This word peace is shalom. It refers to wholeness, wellness, the absence of strife as a result of proper relations between God and man. So the psalm ends, as Derek Kidner puts it, by showing God's power not as naked force, but as the instrument of judgment and salvation for his people. And I think there's a good reminder here for us as we look through this psalm, as we go through to the very end and review what is happening in this psalm. There's a great reminder for Israel, as well as for us, that the Lord, who is our covenant God as well, is powerful, and that the chaos of the world will never overcome him because he is the sovereign Creator God who demonstrates his power over the chaos of the world, over the pridefulness of petty men, and over the dangers that threatens his people. So trust him. Praise him. Ascribe to Yahweh the glory due his name, the glory that remembers his strength and his power and his majesty. And it's a reminder for us in the midst of the chaos and trouble of the pandemic that not only is the Lord more powerful than our problems, he's also our benevolent covenant God and a rock-solid source of hope and peace amidst our storms in life. That's why we took a look at this psalm. Next week, we're going to take a look at Psalm 11. So the assignment today is the assignment that we usually have. Read the psalm ahead of time, identify the strophes, and summarize each. Then write a one-line sentence that explains the primary thrust of the psalm, and we'll compare notes next week. I really appreciate you tuning in to watch our Bible class tonight. If you have any questions, you can email me. Our contact information's on the website. I'll be happy to respond. And remember to join us on Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. for a lesson and Lord's Supper observance. It will be streamed on woodlandcofc.online.church. Thank you for tuning in, and you have a blessed evening.